Good afternoon. My name is Ashley Appling. I'm the Horticulture Extension Agent in the Virginia Cooperative Extension Culpeper County office. And thank you for joining us today. We'll be talking about, as the title says, putting the garden to bed for winter. Today, kind of more of a fallish day, definitely not feeling like winter. So we'll see what happens. Depending on where you're at, you might have had your first freeze, but more than likely you have not. So that is a little bit later, but we are in line with last year. We had it very late October last year and almost into November. So it's not unheard of for the first freeze of fall to come this late. But we'll talk about different topics like that today. First off, we're going to talk about a few tips here and there to get you started in your fall winter garden, what you need to do now. We will then transition into some pruning tips because winter time is one of the best times of the year to prune. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we're going to transition into some planting tips. It's also a good time to start planting. And you can do that now. And if you're not able to do it now, we'll also talk about a couple plants that, just a couple plant examples that it's actually better to plant in the springtime. So we'll talk about that. And I'm mentioning mostly trees and shrubs is what we're referring to. But we'll sprinkle in some other plants here and there also. And then we're going to round it out today with a few select trees and shrubs that I just really like talking about, and maybe it'll jump your curiosity into planting them maybe this fall or next year. So we're definitely going to talk about a few things like that. And to start us off, this is one of the really great quotes, I think, right here. A lot of you that joined early have been seeing this slide since you joined on. So January, usually when all those seed catalogs start coming in, maybe December if the companies are really gung-ho about it. But January is usually the time to see those seed catalogs coming in. Also a good time to plan because there's usually not much you can do out in the garden. I think depends on who you talk to, it seems like nowadays, but we might be having a snowy winter, so we'll just wait and see on that. Last winter was not very snowy at all. It was actually a little bit warmer than average. So a lot of plants that are more what they would call marginal made it through the winter pretty well. So if you had any rosemary over winter, that's the reason for that. It was actually a very lucky winter. Maybe if you sit in a cold spot, maybe to get some of those figs to overwinter. Figs can grow fine in our area, but it just depends on your local microclimate, whether you can successfully grow them or not. And I know y'all are pretty spread out. So we're going to be talking primarily about Northern Virginia area today. Still a couple more people joining on, so it's very exciting, all these people joining us today. Oops. Yes, very exciting. So let's get going. I'll hide this. Oh, it's not letting me hide it because we have lots of enthusiasm apparently still for people joining. So let me get this out of the way. Okay. I did forget to mention, you're welcome to put any chat questions you want in the chat box, but I will not be able to see those during the talk. So we'll go over questions towards the end of the presentation. Okay, I saw a couple people putting in when they're located and what their zone is. If you want to do that, that is a great thing to share with all the participants. Okay, so just some general things and keep in mind. Don't worry about the following. So leaf and needle drop on evergreens, shrubs, and trees. So what are we mentioning more specifically about that? So mostly the questions we have come in are about pine trees. So fall is a very good time of year to start seeing the leaves turn yellow on pine trees. And even though we call them evergreen trees, the needles on pines, on spruces, on firs, and even on broadleaf evergreens, leaves and needles actually only live about 3 to 4 years. So they do drop off eventually. So that's what we're seeing this time of year, especially on pines, like I said before. And one way to really verify if you are worried about your pine tree is if the needles are turning yellow on the interior of the branches towards the middle of the tree. That is normal. If you're seeing yellowing on the outer edge of the branches, on the tips of the branches, then that's more concerning. That's when you might want to start worrying a little bit. Needles on the interior dropping off, perfectly fine. They're just dropping from old age. If your pine tree or other evergreen has been growing very quickly, it's dropping because sunlight's not reaching those leaves and they're not worth anything to the plant at that point. They're more of a liability than anything else. So we get a lot of questions about that, so that's why I want to touch on that pretty quick. Especially in our area of Virginia, that has been going on in full force over the past couple of weeks. I know the pine tree, the white pine in my yard, oh, you got a little sneak peek. The white pine in my yard is definitely looking like the picture on the next slide. So that's something definitely to look out for if you haven't noticed that before. Pruning back perennials in the garden. A lot of folks say to prune them now. Other people say to prune them in the springtime. So that always kind of a head scratcher for most people. What do you do? What do you do now? So the most general recommendation now for most professionals and most researchers is to leave the seed heads on plants during the fall and into winter. So Rudbeckias, echinaceas, and goldenrods, sunflowers even provide food for birds and other wildlife. Leaving the plant material, the dead plant material above ground also provides nesting sites for beneficial insects. So leaving that up, they will overwinter in those old stalks and flower stalks from all these different perennials. So leaving those up over the winter gives them a spot to do that. So that's very important to do. And if you absolutely just wait as long as you can, if you're getting a little bit of an itch to start cleaning stuff up. Late winter, early spring, clean up all that plant material to your heart's delight. But just keep that in mind, especially if the beneficial insects need your help in that regard. Very, very much helps them overwinter in that plant material. Even in leaf covers too, a lot of people will remove all the leaves on their property, and a lot of beneficial insects are overwintering in the leaf materials also. Okay, nobody else joining. Oh, spoke too soon. So here's just some general pictures. I know I like looking at pictures. That's how I learn. So this is the pine tree in the upper left-hand picture. Any kind of pine. Doesn't it just have to be a white pine? It's any kind of pine you might find on your property. That interior yellowing of the needles, that is normal. Like I said, they usually only live about 3, maybe 5 years, depending on the species. And then those needles will be lost, will drop off the tree. And spruces and firs do a very, very similar process. It's not always quite as dramatic as pines. And a lot of people walk out front one day and the pine looks like this, and that's when we start getting questions. So this is normal. You can see the outer tips of the branches are green still, and only the interior needles, like I was mentioning before, are turning yellow, and that is normal. And then just a seed head from an echinacea, you want to keep those up, especially goldfinches. Actually, most of my goldfinches have already gone to town on these. But any kind of perennial plant that produces a seed like this or anything similar is very good food for overwinter. So keeping those stalks up for the birds, the other wildlife, and for the beneficial insects is very important. So the frost date. So we are already past where our average frost date in Northern Virginia zone. So if you live locally, your zone's very near Shenandoah National Park, you might be zone 6A in Upper Madison County. If you're going down into Madison, Culpeper, Orange County, and down to Charlottesville, a little bit closer to DC, you are either 7A or mostly 7A. Closer to DC, you're going to be 7B. So I'm going to show show the USDA map on the next slide for if you just don't know what that is. And you got this is the PowerPoint's being touchy today. Every time I let somebody in, but our usual first freeze date is October 20th here in Northern Virginia. And that's the average. So we usually say plus or minus 10 days on either side of that. So if you're adding in 10 days past that date, we're actually not there yet. But looking at the local weather forecast, we're not going to even hit it, maybe close on Saturday, but it actually doesn't look like it. So it looks like this year we might go into November in regards to our first frost freeze date. So just keep that in mind. If you planted your grass seed a little bit later, or if you planted some of those cover crops in your vegetable garden a little bit later, you probably got away with it this year, for sure. It's also a great time of year to think about soil testing. So if you haven't soil tested in your local garden, your garden area, your vegetable garden, for example, your lawn area, your flower beds, if you haven't tested those areas in 3 years, it's a good idea to retest. And we'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. Also, great tips to keep in mind. You can clean, sharpen, and store your garden tools right now. Leaving them out in the wintry weather all winter can really do a number on your tools. So cleaning, sharpening, and storing them is very important. You don't want to, I saw a story one time, it's more of a plant disease issue, but this lady was storing, she was oiling up her tools and storing them in sand in the ground. She said she saw that on a gardening show. And unintentionally, she was spreading root knot to all of her plants around the garden. So if you haven't seen that, it makes a very big round ball, hard balls of cells on the plant. Usually roses get this a lot. And that's root knot nematodes because they got on the tools from the sand that was contaminated. So make sure you're storing your tools in a correct way. In a shed would be preferable. Storing hoses in a protected area is important. And turning off those water valves. Even here in Virginia, those water valves will definitely freeze if you leave them unprotected. So make sure to cover all that up. Make sure to do that. So here's the USDA plant hardiness zone map for Virginia. So we are located in the northern part of the state here, of course. Culpeper, Madison, and Orange counties are my working areas in Virginia as a Virginia Cooperative Extension agent. And you can see most of this area is what is considered Zone 7A. That northern part of Madison County near Shenandoah National Park is more 6B. 6A is actually in the park. So if you lived in the park, you'd be 6A. But 7A is considered an average minimum temperature of 0 to 5 degrees in the wintertime. Last winter, we definitely did not hit that in our part of Virginia. I think the lowest we got was maybe in the teens last year. So it wasn't, that's the reason if you had rosemary over winter, that's the reason for that. So keeping in mind where your zone is very important, especially when you're buying different shrubs, different trees. You don't want to buy something that only can overwinter in Zone 8A, which is actually Virginia Beach area in our state. So make sure to check the plant tags. All the plant tags will have the zones listed on there for its low minimum temperature. So we're mostly talking about the cold here because this slide shows is on the winter time. But there's also a heat zone map that comes from the American Horticultural Society, and that can help out a lot too. So some plants we can't grow here because of the heat. Some heathers, depending on what part of the state you're in, rhubarb might not be growing very easily. So looking at that map, I don't have an example here, but the American Horticulture Society website has a heat map as well. But the USDA plant hardiness map is one of the most valuable tools you can use. Really lets you know what you can grow in your area. Oh, I forgot the circle. Soil testing. So here in Virginia, soil testing is first step in adding amendments, of course. Like I said before, fall is a great time to take the soil test. So it's one sample per garden area. So we'll describe that a little bit more on the next slide, what that means. Here in Virginia, if you're a homeowner, it's $10 per soil test. So you can go to any extension office in the state, and every county has an extension office, and you'll pick up a little square box. And you get your little square box. So it's $10 plus whatever postage you're going to send it to Virginia Tech with. So you get a box. You can get more than one. But a key to keep in mind is that you're going to put your soil subsamples into that box. So what does a subsample mean? So first off, you want to get yourself a clean 5-gallon bucket. Maybe something bigger if you're doing a lot of soil testing. So you get yourself that clean bucket, pick your garden area out. So if your garden area is flat and uniform, then you can compile all those subsamples together into one sample that you put in that box and send off to Virginia Tech. So 10 subsamples is what we recommend. You can always do more, and you crisscross in a completely randomized pattern across your garden area. So if you're doing it across your vegetable garden, walk back and forth as many times as you can, as randomly as you can, and you take your sample. You can use a trowel, a shovel, any kind of digging device. And the soil sampling depths are listed at the bottom of this slide. So if you're taking a soil sample from an established lawn, we suggest you go at least 2 to 4 inches down. Vegetable and flower garden beds, if you're doing more no-till practices, it's 6 or 8 inches. Or if you're tilling that garden bed, you go down to tillage depth. So either of those for vegetable and flower beds. So what we're referring to with flower beds here is more annual production. I would consider perennial plants more in the tree and shrub area of the sampling depth chart. And as you can see, trees and shrubs about 6 inches down is all you need to do. And you do the random selection all around there. Trees, I would go out at least to the drip line and maybe a little bit past the drip line of the tree. So that's where most of the feeder roots are going to be. Next to the trunk, there are roots there, but most of the nutrients are being taken up at the drip line or a little bit further out than that. So researchers have proven that trees, it's always amazing. It's amazing to me. You can see the canopy, the drip line of a tree, and the roots are usually going out at least 2 to 4 times the diameter of the drip line of the tree. So your roots are going out much further than what the crown is on the tree. So always keep that in mind. I would either do it at the drip line or a little bit out from that. So you're going to thoroughly mix those subsamples into your bucket. Allow the sample to air dry if needed. In a droughty year, you don't have to do that in a drought year. Fill out all the information on the requested form, and you don't seal the box. It's very loosely. It has a little tab that you can close the box with. Uh, do not put the info sheet in the box. The soil testing lab at Virginia Tech has had lots of people do that. And by the time this sheet gets there, especially if the soil's more wet, the sheet is unreadable. So don't do that. I did not mention, so we talked about a uniform garden bed earlier. If you have more of a slope, the slope should be a different sample. If you have an area where it stays wet, that should be a different sample. If you have an area where the pet goes to the bathroom all the time, that should be a different sample. So any abnormalities should be a different sample. So most vegetable gardens aren't huge. And so you could probably get away with just one box that you're going to mail off to Virginia Tech. And what are you getting for this? So a standard test will tell you, it does not tell you nitrogen because nitrogen varies too much depending on weather conditions and other factors, biological factors too. But they will tell you all the other major nutrients. So phosphorus all the way through zinc. So boron can be important in vegetable garden beds. So boron is a recommendation that we're seeing pop up more commonly. So all those different nutrients will be listed. You can pay an additional, I think it's only $2 or $4 for a organic matter test. And you can figure out how much you're starting at. A good starting point, especially if you're trying to build up the organic matter, that'd be a good thing to test, to put in your soil test. And like I mentioned, every 3 years is what we recommend for this. So I spent a lot of time on soil testing, but it isn't a very important aspect of your any of these garden beds we mentioned. So it will also tell you the pH, which is very important in our area. A lot of our soils are on the acidic side. Most of the time you'll find from 5.4 up to maybe 6.5. Our soils can vary that much. And they will give you a lime recommendation. You don't have to put all that lime that they recommend down at one time. They actually have very specific instructions not to put it down all at one time. But lots of people are surprised on how much lime their gardens need. Sometimes it is in the tons, depending on how large of an area that you told them that you might need to lime. So that's why it's a good reason to get it tested in the fall. You can plan out for that. If you have a level garden area, putting down the lime in the fall is fine. If you have more of a slope, I would wait till springtime to put your lime recommendation down, or start putting it down if you have a lot to put down. And you can slowly put it down at different intervals throughout the growing season, and even into the next year if you need to. So these are all good tips, and these will get your plants growing very nicely. So in a vegetable garden, we usually recommend 6.2 up to 7.2 is where most vegetables grow pretty well. So that's where you're going to find it. Most trees will grow pretty well in the high 5s and into the 6s. So pH is a measure of the amount of hydrogen ions in the soil. So more acidic, you have more. So it just plays into that. Sorry for not going in depth on that, but we usually go more in depth on that on a soils class. So really, really important. That's why I spent so much time on these couple slides. So watering evergreens can be very helpful, especially up until, if the soil's frozen, of course, it doesn't work. But keeping evergreens hydrated, especially if we have a dry fall. We had a very dry fall last year. This fall's been more wet. So you don't have to worry about it quite as much. But broadleaf evergreens, any evergreens you're trying to get established in the garden, making sure to water those as you can. If the soil's frozen, like I mentioned before, it doesn't really help much. And new plantings in general can help them overwinter very readily. Raking or shredding the leaves. So raking is not really recommended. Shredding the leaves, especially in a lawn area, is what we recommend here in Virginia. Raking, if you are going to rake them up, put them into a compost bin or something like that, or a compost pile. And then once it's broken down a little bit, you can use it as mulch. Makes great mulch in a vegetable garden bed. And if you shred it over a lawn area, it fertilizes your lawn for you, so you don't have to put down as much fertility. If you're cleaning up around the garden bed and you notice diseases in a particular area, so maybe you get really, really hard hit with peonies every year, and you're getting powdery mildew and black spot and the measles on, there's a disease called measles on peonies. It's actually pretty bright red. But if you're getting any heavy disease issues, collecting all that plant material and actually sending it off to landfill is the best thing to do. You can also burn it. So if you are going to burn that kind of material, do it in a safe way, follow all your local regulations and other rules regarding that. Turning the compost pile weekly is important, and that introduces air, oxygen into the compost pile and will help with the decomposition process. And keeping it moist too, that is important so that the different microorganisms can get to work on your compost pile. And compost makes great fertilizer too. So we haven't really talked about cover crops, but compost and cover crops, and you are probably pretty much set in your vegetable garden bed. Bulbs. So especially with a late fall, you can get it's a great time to plant your different bulbs. So your different tulips, your daffodils, crocuses, watch out for the squirrels and chipmunks and other things like that. They usually find crocuses as a snack, excuse me. Voles too. Voles can eat tulips, but they will not touch daffodils. I have actually had, it's more of the warm springs and early summers here in Virginia. It's the reason that tulips don't always come back every year. But I've had luck putting, so you want to plant your bulbs more in a not one everywhere. You want to kind of group them together into different designs, and that looks prettier in your vegetable garden bed. I have found planting the tulips in the center of your design and planting the daffodils around them can really help out if you have a heavy vole population in your garden. And that's vole with a V. Moles, of course, eat different earthworms and other critters, and voles are what are eating your plants. So that they have to go through that barrier, basically, of daffodil bulbs to get to the tulips. And most voles don't go through the time to do that. So that is a good way to try to combat that. Planting garlic in your garden can also help. Maybe planting garlic on the perimeter around your bulbs you're trying to protect can help against voles too, because they don't really eat garlic, unless I guess if they're really hungry, and that goes for deer too. Deer will eat stuff you wouldn't even think they would touch if they're really hungry. Other types of, so the other bulbs and tubers and corms we're mentioning are ones you might be overwintering. So maybe elephant ears, maybe you're a real canna lover, or a calla lily lover, or something, or even some gladioluses don't overwinter, so you have to dig those up too. So just make sure they're not rotting during the winter time. Make sure that they do not desiccate. So that's basically means drying out during the winter time. So keep that in mind too. Usually amaryllis also, you can keep those in a pot over summer, let them dry out a little bit, and you can force them to rebloom. And you don't only have to plant bulbs in the ground outside. You can also plant them in a container and enjoy them all winter time indoors. So if you are going to go that route, make sure to buy. Most of the ones you buy from the big box stores are pre-chilled, but if you're going to use different container grown bulbs to have flowers throughout the winter inside, make sure to get ones that are chilled, pre-chilled. It's also a good time to apply different dormant oils, especially if you've fought evergreen mites and other scale issues. If you have those on your plants throughout your garden, it's a great time to do horticultural oils. Uh, most of the times the recommendations on those say that you do have to let it warm up a little bit. So most of the time the recommendations say that you shouldn't have freezing temperatures in there for at least a day or so. So these horticultural oils would be early transition fall, winter, or late winter, spring in our area. That's when you'd want to really use these dormant oils. The only reason for that is that if it warms up during the day and then it freezes, the oil can actually lead to quicker burning of the leaves, especially if they're evergreen plants. And evergreen mites are mites that are active in the winter time, so that's why you're applying these oils for them. Not all scale insects can be controlled using dormant oils. So always look that up or contact your extension agent to make sure that you're using the right products for the different insects. And we haven't really talked about transitioning. I know I grow a number of plants outside during the summertime. So you want to make sure to treat those for insects before you bring them inside, especially if you're growing citrus. You could have a lot of mite issues if you bring them inside. Even bringing them inside into a greenhouse can be a big thing like that. You want to get rid of the mites. The best thing for that that I have found is insecticidal soap. That will take care of them, of the two-spotted spider mite very readily. And try to get those plants in before the freeze comes. I know I've scrambled before moving all my plants in the night of. I think there's a freeze coming. But if you can plan that out, it makes it so much more enjoyable if you can plan it out beforehand. So we already mentioned the deer and the voles earlier. So protecting young trees and shrubs is really important. You can use some kind of fencing. So most of the time the rabbit fencing, chicken fencing, some kind of metal fencing like that, something that's more pliable that you can make a little cylinder around the trees or shrubs can really help. You do want to make it high enough that the deer can't put their neck and head into it, but that can really help protect young trees and shrubs. Keep mulch at least 2 to 3 inch. We recommend a 2 to 3 inch depth for the mulch, and to keep it about a ½ inch away from the base of the plant. So you don't want the mulch directly touching the trunk or the trunk of the shrub or tree. So having that ½ inches away actually does more than you think. It keeps the trunk doesn't stay wet from the mulch being wet. It also deters a little bit, deters voles from chewing on your bushes and your trees, chewing the bark, because there's that little bit of a gap. It doesn't sound like a lot, but that is enough in some cases to protect it from vole damage. If the mulch is thicker than 2 to 3 inches and it's right up against the bark, that's actually becomes kind of protective layer. So the voles don't even have to emerge from the mulch. They can just stay under that and be protected from different predators in that case. And also keep in mind, if you don't know what a mulch volcano is, we have a couple pictures coming up for that too. So don't do mulch volcanoes. You can have all kinds of different disease problems come into play. All the different little critters will hide in there. Insects can hide in those mulch layers and attack your trees. And it also, the roots of some trees will actually grow into the mulch. And as you can imagine, during drought conditions, the mulch will dry out completely. The roots die, and that can weaken the trees too. We've already mentioned the compost pile stuff. So here's one in Northern Virginia. The mulch is piled pretty high up on the tree, this little eastern flowering dogwood. Cornus Florida right here. And this is causing most of this is not fall right here. So this is causing most of the branch dieback at the very top. So this bark is way too high. So spreading it out could help. This dogwood is actually pretty badly along in this case. So basically, like I said before, this is the trunk staying too wet. The roots are probably growing up into this mulch layer. and during drought conditions, they're going to dry out. Different voles can hide in this too, and actually chew at the bark of the young trees. I had an apple grower, I guess year before last now, but an apple grower lost all the trees they planted the previous year to vole damage. So the voles went around every single little tree, chewed all the bark in a complete circle around it, and basically girdled all his apple trees. So that's something to keep in mind. You really want to watch out for that. So no mulch volcanoes, please. And here's a tree that the mulch was removed, but you can already see the damage done right here. So the roots did grow up into the mulch layer. So you should be seeing a healthy tree flare here going towards the ground. And these roots should not be present. They should be under the grass. So you can actually see this tree is actually split too. So this tree is in bad sorts right here. They did remove all the mulch, but it's going to be a lot of babying trying to get this tree to keep going. This tree's in bad sorts. And then the grass is growing right up to the tree too, which is not helping a lot. This is not what you want to see in your garden. So when to prune? Pruning can be the wintertime is one of the great times of the year to prune. So crown cleaning, so any water sprouts that might come up in the summertime. If a shrub is growing out of bounds in the summertime, maybe over your walkway, go ahead and prune that. So don't wait till winter to prune those kind of things. But wintertime is a great time to prune any crossing branches, any branches that are growing inwards on your tree or shrub, any water sprouts that are growing directly up, selecting your central leader on your tree. It's easier to see that in the wintertime when the leaves have fallen, especially on deciduous trees. So it's all better times. It's a great time of year to prune. Maximize for spring growth. So a lot of roses and other types of shrubs, we wait till Valentine's Day is a good rule of thumb to wait till do that around here. A lot of trees, there aren't a lot of insect pests in that time of year. So it is a good time of year to do all your pruning. And the stress is reduced, of course. So that's a good time too. So a lot of people have questions on timing for this kind of thing. So our next slide goes into that. So influence on flowering. So trees and shrubs that bloom on the current season's growth, you prune in the winter. So what does that mean? So trees and shrubs that bloom on the current season's growth would be bushes such as the hydrangea paniculatus. So that's more of the summertime hydrangeas. So limelight is one of the most famous cultivars of that series, of that species of hydrangea. So you can prune that one in the winter. It's making all of its flower buds on the current season's growth. So that is a great one to do. Summertime pruning after they bloom is for any trees or shrubs. So these trees and shrubs are making their flower buds late summer and fall of the previous year. So these include crab apples, most of our flowering trees, such as cherries, other apples, pears. Any tree you see bloom in the springtime any shrub you see bloom in the springtime falls into this category. So the French type hydrangeas would fall into this category. That's why you don't prune them in the winter time. You're going to prune the flowers off. So so with hydrangeas, after they finish flowering, that's when you prune them if you need to. After peaches bloom, that's when you prune them, is after they're finished blooming. And that's what our orchards in this area, if they grow peaches, that's how they prune them. They wait for the peaches to bloom, and then they'll prune them after that point. There's also lots of great research into, especially with our flowering fruiting trees, pruning them in the winter time can actually break, they call it breaking dormancy. So some fruiting trees it can actually cause them to bloom earlier by pruning those in the winter. So we talked about earlier that pruning in general is good in the winter time, but like we said here, there's always exceptions to that. So keep these rules in mind. Hydrangea is always the great example. If you have French type hydrangeas, so those are going to bloom late spring, usually in May in our area. So that's when you prune those right after they finish blooming. If you have more of the paniculata types, so limelight and some of the other cultivars such as those will bloom more June, July, into August. You can prune those the previous winter. So that's perfectly fine. And researching and doing it through experience also when your shrubs bloom can tell you when you can prune them without issue. This does not come into play if you just really, really want to hack back on a shrub. Go ahead and prune that. That's perfectly fine. We are past the point. Some plants, it's very important not to prune those in late summertime. Boxwood is a very good example of that. Hollies can go into that category too. You can actually, if we have a warm spring or warm fall, pardon me, they can actually start leafing out again, and that can be frozen back once the freeze comes. So a lot of evergreen shrubs, you shouldn't prune those in real late summer, early fall. Just in case we do have a warm fall and they start growing again, that can really do a lot of damage. So of course, some trees and shrubs will actually are what we call bleeders. So maples, where maple syrup comes, of course, birch syrup is actually pretty good too. So maples and birches and other types of trees that fall into that category, they will drip sap, especially in early spring. And sometimes that sap can be very heavy. It can be very alarming to see these trees, grapes especially if you've ever pruned grapes. They can actually, it almost looks like a waterfall sometimes if you haven't seen that before. This actually does not cause any harm to the tree. If you're just really distressed about it and it is kind of unsightly, just wait till summer to prune these kind of trees and shrubs. So the bleeders, it does not damage them to prune those still in the winter time, or early spring too. So what kind of cuts do you do? So you could do reduction cuts, as we see in the upper picture here, or you can do removal cuts. So reduction cuts shorten the length of the stem back to a smaller limb. So this is this little small picture at the top here. So the dotted lines are what you're removing at the top right here, and you're cutting it back to a side branch. So that's where you're cutting it back to. And you can see this is a very nice cut because the branch is now going outward and it's not competing with your central leader anymore of the tree. So that's what we refer to as a reduction cut. Arborists refer to that as a reduction cut. A removal cut, you're actually pruning, you're going to cut it back on the trunk. So you can see there is a big difference here. And you're removing the entire branch all the way back to the trunk. And you're doing a similar thing, but it's more drastic. You're going to end up with a bigger cut, usually, when you go all the way back to the trunk. So you can see in this illustration here, it's showing the collar on the branch. And you're seeing here you don't prune into that collar. So we have some pictures on the next slide. Actually, that's the slide after this, but we'll stay on this one right now. This slide is showing you how to make a proper pruning cut on a large branch. So there's a 3-step process that's recommended, especially if you're pruning the branch by yourself. You can see right here, you make your first cut, and that's called the undercut, a little bit out from the collar. So the collar is right here. So you don't cut into the collar. You see it's a little bit out. Is where you make the pruning cut, this dashed line right here. And that's because a lot of the tissues that are going to seal the wound are in that collar. There's a lot of good material, there's a lot of protective, the tree has a lot of protective elements built into that collar. And that's a really strong point too. There's a lot of tissue in that point of contact with the branch. So you make this undercut, that first cut, you go a little bit out, you make your second cut, that's the top cut, that's taking the pressure off. Basically, this is making sure that you don't accidentally make your cuts and then the whole branch peels off of the tree. You want to make a clean cut outside of that collar. So if there's too much weight, if you prune it improperly, there could be too much weight and it actually rips off of the tree, and that causes all kinds of different issues at that point. You want to cut outside the collar, clean cut as you can. You can make it a little slanted, not really slanted, but you can do a little bit so that water doesn't collect on that spot. And you will know that the tree or the shrub will let you know if you made a good cut. You'll see the callus tissue form around the outer edge of your cut. And if it's a complete, it looks nice all around the edges, then you did a good job. Sometimes if you cut too far into the collar on the sides, or maybe you cut too far into the collar on the bottom, then you'll have an uneven callusing of the wound. It'll just take the tree longer to seal the wound at that point. So leave the collar intact. Your tree will seal the wound a lot easier. And I am saying seal with an S. Trees don't heal, they seal the wound, the different cuts and different wounds that they receive. So here's more of a real live example with this picture here. You can see this tree shows it very well. Not all trees do, but you can see the collar very readily. And these arrows right here are showing it nicely too. So there's a pencil drawing here. Going down into the collar is a no. It looks like you're leaving a little bit of a stub, but that's actually what you want to do. So you cut right here where this yes line is. You see it is slanted, so the water is going to run off. So that is what you want to do. And the collar, you can see it's the swelling point between the branch and the trunk. And like I said earlier, it has a lot of good energy reserves in that collar, and also different chemicals to hinder the decay, the spread of decay, I should say. So this is really good to keep in mind. And like I mentioned before, the tree will let you know. It'll show you, not fast, but during the next growing season, it will let you know if you made a good cut or not, with the presence of that callus tissue. And here's another example of the collar. It's very evident on this tree. Strong connection here. Different shrubs and stuff. There's different pruning techniques to keep in mind. You can make thinning cuts on shrubs too. Right. So you can see all these thinning cuts here.
5% lang sa'yo, di ba?
Whoops. Yep. There we go. Muted everybody again. So you can make thinning cuts on the shrubs. So you're cutting back kind of like reduction cuts we were talking about earlier. So you're just taking out individual branches and thinning it out that way. Or a lot of people do heading cuts, especially if they're doing different shrubs. Boxwoods can be hedged, but it's actually better to thin out boxwoods. They look nicer in the long run. So different shapes. You don't want a flat top. That can collect snow, that's bad. Straight lines require more frequent trimming. So this is really bad. This is a bad snow load here anyway. So you want more rounded shapes. You see narrow at the top and wider at the base. That's what you want to see. And rounded shapes in general, if you're going to be heading back the plants, shearing the plants, that does produce more of a natural shape, as natural as it can be, I guess, at that point. So you narrow at the top, wide at the base is what you want to see for shrubs. So you see this one's been flip-flopped. That is bad. Snow is going to collect on the top. You see this little half mush, this half meatball right here. That's what you want to see if you want that kind of shape. You don't want to prune inwards at the bottom. Light can't get down there, so the plant, those branches are going to die anyway, and that just causes lots of bad issues. So these are just some real quick shrub rules to follow right here. So fall is a great time to plant different hardy deciduous shrubs, different evergreen plants. Also a good time to divide and transplant perennials. If you're trying to grow more marginal plants for your area, it's actually recommended to plant those in the springtime. So different camellias in our area, the different osmanthus, tea olives you want to plant in the springtime, and different figs. Basically, the research has shown planting them in the spring, giving them an entire summer to grow and root out, can really help them to overwinter the next winter. So all that growing season is very important if you're trying to plant different marginal shrubs. But everything else, if it's completely hardy in your area, no problem at all. Go ahead and plant that in the fall if you can find them. Sometimes it's not easy to find it in the fall because it seems like everybody wants to buy the plants, or at least the retailers want to sell the plants when they're in full bloom. So most plants are for sale in the springtime. But if you can find them in the fall, plant them in the fall. And like I said, if it's marginal, plant that one in the springtime, those kind of plants for your area. Incorrect and correct planting. Of course, you don't want to, you want to plant the evergreens, so they make a more of a wind barrier in the winter time. You don't want the evergreens on the south side of your house because that'll block the winter sun from reaching your house. You want to plant the deciduous trees so that they provide shade in the summertime on the southern side of your house, and then let the sunlight in the wintertime. You also don't want to plant over your septic field. So that's really important to keep in mind too. And you can see right here, the way these evergreens are planted, it's actually bringing the wind in towards the house. So planting them more of as a windbreak is really important. And you can see these trees are actually growing over the house, which is not ideal. You don't want to plant them, the larger trees, more planted in the background, and keep the shorter trees close to the house. And don't plant the large trees under the power lines, as you can see in this diagram also. Planting smaller trees, trees that only grow 15 feet, maybe 20 feet max, is what you want to plant under the power lines. Try to go lower if you can. And then you don't have to worry about them getting pruned back all the time if you do that. And this is from, yes, this is found, this is one of Virginia Tech's publications here. So when you're selecting plants, you want to look for well-formed, vigorous plants, check for obvious signs of diseases, take the plant out of the pot, look at the roots. You also want to avoid stock with a heavy base suckering, so sending up a lot of shoots that shouldn't be there. Don't buy that plant. Don't buy it. Usually plants that are in the clearance section have been neglected, so those are good ones not to buy. And also make sure to examine all bark and foliage for obvious signs of disease and other insect issues. So you're looking for mites there, you're looking for scale insects, you're looking for aphids, different diseases like powdery mildew, the different downy mildews. Just make sure your plants are free from all those kind of issues. So creating the root zone, not just a planting hole, so you want to make it wider than it is deep. Remove any turf and weeds from the planting site. Locate the root flare, especially if you're using balled and burlap trees. Measure the depth of the root ball so you got it right. break up soil at least 3 to 5 times the diameter of the root ball. So like I said before, wider instead of deeper. You only want the depth of the plant should be the depth of the root ball. So you don't want to go deeper than that. A little bit higher is better because most plants will settle to their proper height in the soil. So the reason you're making your root zone is to create a strong base for the root ball. And you don't, for trees and shrubs, we do not recommend adding anything to the soil. So having the natural soil unamended forces the roots to grow out into that surrounding soil more quickly. So if you are amending the planting hole, you're basically, especially in our clay soils, you're kind of making a clay pot. And sometimes that'll cause the roots just to circle, circle, circle and stay in that hole and not go out. So they're more susceptible to drought and other issues at that point. And we are coming up on time. So I will leave y'all with this picture here. So this is the proper planting, well-constructed planting hole. So the hole is wider at the top, gradually sloping out. So you can see there's a little bit area of undisturbed soil right here. The root ball, the original root ball is on top of that. And this is what I was talking with the planting zone. So you can see it's wider than it is deep. Unamended soil is what we recommend for trees and shrubs. If you are growing different annuals, vegetable plants, of course, and then that soil, make it all nice for the root zone area. Trees and shrubs, we do not recommend it. We do not recommend amended soil. Then you can see a little bit of a mulch layer there, and you can see it's not touching the trunk. Okay, so let's go into the questions now and see what we got going on. Yeah, people from all over the areas. Thank y'all for joining today. So we had a question about greenhouses. So I used to work in a greenhouse. Depending on where you're located at, having some kind of curtains, thermal curtains you can pull is really important, especially for heat retention in the winter time. You really want to make sure to keep on top of that. In regard, I guess it really matters, really depends on what you're growing in the greenhouse. So heating will be the major cost, especially in the winter time. Other than that, growing in the greenhouse isn't too different. You do have to look out for diseases and insects. They can really linger in the greenhouse, especially the two-spotted spider mite. Oh yeah, all over the place. Yeah, welcome. Thank y'all for joining today. In DC, depending on what part of DC you're at, you might actually be 7B to A to A. Along the Potomac River, especially in Alexandria and Arlington in Virginia, some of that area is 8A actually next to the river. So it just depends on where you're at. That's more of a microclimate going on there. Yeah, $8 isn't out of the realm of possibility for shipping costs. Soil does weigh a lot, so that's true. Oh, the shredding of the leaves. So shredding is usually recommended. A lot of people will just rake the leaves off your lawn. Leaving the leaves on the lawn unshredded especially considering what kind of winter we're having, can kill the grass. So you just have to keep that in mind. Shredding the leaves is much, much better than raking it up and putting it on the curb or you're taking it to landfill. So that's kind of a compromise. But leaving them unshredded you're correct. That's much better for the pollinators. Composting, we didn't really talk about it much here. It'll usually take a full season. You're not going to see much work in the wintertime unless you're have more of a, if you're really keeping on top of your compost pile and keeping the heat up, you're going to see more activity in the wintertime. Other than that, it's probably going to be a full growing season even too before you really see a lot of good compost being formed. Oh, I didn't mention dahlia bulbs, did I? Dahlia bulbs in our area of Virginia, yes, you do have to remove those from the ground. That is correct. Insecticidal soap can help with fungus gnats, but it has to touch them. So it's hard to do. Yes, I hate fungus gnats for sure. Oh, asparagus fronds. You want to cut those as close to the soil level as you can. You don't want to cut into the crown, but you do want to cut those pretty low. And make sure you leave some fronds too, because that is the leaves for the asparagus. Getting trees and roots removed inexpensively. Oh, so you're going to take down the whole tree. So I didn't read your question quite right the first time. That's going to be very expensive. I know in our area, getting a full-size mature oak tree down, that's going to, cheapest is probably $1,000 to $800. Getting a tree taken down is not cheap. It's probably more than that depending on where you're at. Grinding the stump is a good thing if once you get the tree down to that point. But taking a tree down is not easy, and removing the roots from a neighbor's yard is even harder to do. If the tree's dead, digging them up is what you can really do. It's very, very expensive to get rid of a tree in general. I apologize, but there's not a ton of cheap things to do getting rid of a tree. Asparagus, you can dig up the crowns and give them away to neighbors. I guess that's really the great thing to do to prevent the spread. You could also, if you want to keep it in a centralized area, you can just cut down more of the fronds along the outer edge, and that kind of starves it on that outer edge. But digging up the crowns and dividing them, that's really the best thing to do with asparagus. You could put in some kind of metal barrier, but that's more money in that regard. Oh, crown cleaning, the term we used for crown cleaning in this presentation was more for cleaning out branches and trees and shrubs. That's what I was referring to there. Marginal shrubs are shrubs that, so for an example, we're in zone 7A. Here, if the plant is listed more for 7B, maybe 8A, that would be more of a marginal shrub here. So sometimes it'll overwinter and sometimes it will not. Rosemary comes into that category very readily. Some of the osmanthus, the fragrant tea olives, can fall into that category. Some of the fig cultivars can fall into that. So that's basically a shrub or a tree that will overwinter most of the time, but some winters it will not. So that's what more we're referring to as a marginal shrub here. You could divide, as long as the ground's unfrozen, you could divide or replant dormant perennials throughout the winter. It's not going to hurt them to do that, especially if they're dormant. They're not even going to know they got moved. So as long as the ground's unfrozen, you can do it. Lavender, no problem at all. Zone 6A. You could grow you can grow a lot of different types of lavender with success in zone 6A. Rosemary, probably better to grow in a pot. You're going to be sad a lot of winters in zone 6A trying to grow rosemary, unfortunately. Rosemary is one of my favorites, and I'm here in zone 7A, and I must be in a cold spot because I lose my rosemary almost every winter, so it's very sad. Lavender, no problem at all, though. Yeah, if you put it down a very thin layer of compost around your trees, that is perfect. So 2 inches, 3 inches of compost, spread it out as evenly as you can around the tree. That's great. That's a great thing to do. So cleaning and sharpening gardening tools is not too hard to do. You can get it professionally done if you want, using a sharpening kit, doing it by hand. You're just changing the shape of the edge, basically making it more like it was before. And oil, you can get that from any kind of gardening shop or any other kind of spot. It doesn't have to be really any special kind of thing. Just an oil that's not going to start growing funky stuff, I guess. But knocking all the soil off is very, very important. Keeping it in a dry location, actually, I don't usually oil my gardening tools, but keeping them in a shed out of the moisture and the winter cold, you'll get great success doing that. Perennials that need shade in the summer, do they need it in the winter time? Most perennials in general, I'm going to assume that you're growing are dormant in the winter. So no, they don't need shade in the winter then. And iris actually don't need much mulch in our area at all. No, they're fine without mulch. The iris rhizomes actually should be on the top of the soil line. They shouldn't be buried. So they don't need much mulch. Irises are perfectly hardy in our area. Blackberries and raspberries. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with amending the soil for those. Yeah, especially if you're going to grow blueberries. You do really want to amend the soil then too, for sure. So watering in general, it's hard to put a hard rule on watering for trees during the winter time. If we're getting if we have a droughty winter where it hasn't snowed much, it hasn't rained much, and the ground's not frozen, go ahead and water your shrub. It's really just keeping track of the weather. You might only have to water it once a month. If it's a deciduous tree, just make sure to water it well in the winter time, in the fall during establishment, and you're pretty good throughout the winter then. I wouldn't water it again. It's not losing water anyway. So that rule is mostly just for evergreen shrubs that you're planting. But if we're getting enough snow, we're getting enough rain, you don't have to water at all. So it really just depends on the weather. So you purchased a small camellia about a week ago. So I'm thinking it really depends on what type it is. Sasanquas are the type that bloom in the fall. Japonicas bloom in the springtime. So if it's a fall blooming Sasanqua, I would go ahead and plant that one. The rule I was talking about for the spring planting of camellias is really more for the Japonica types. So looking at the plant label, finding out what kinds you have is very important. If it's a Sasanqua, go ahead and plant it right now. There's no problem to that at all. I would wait with Japonicas though. I would wait till the springtime to plant those. They usually have a bigger leaf, more broad leaf, and they can get hurt a little bit more if we have a real cold winter. Sasanquas should be fine though. One of the diagrams came from a book. I think that was more of a publication. I don't remember mentioning a diagram from a book. And that is that is Virginia Cooperative Extension publication, which I cannot remember the name for right this second. But I'll definitely look that up and send that out when I send out the recording of the presentation. I can send out the name of that to y'all. Dividing iris, you can do that now. Yeah, that's no problem at all. Zone 7B, you're growing corn. Oh, growing it in a greenhouse even. Light is going to be your light right now is going to be your limiting factor. The days are getting shorter, and corn really needs some more light to grow. So grow lights can help, but they're expensive. Light is going to be your limiting factor, unfortunately, for growing corn right now. Unless you can provide grow lights, it's not much else you can do. Corn's just going to grow slowly, I'm sorry to say. If you haven't, if you're keeping on top of your composting bins, more than likely it's going to take a full season. It's not going to be something instant, so it's going to take at least a full season. So if you start it now, you're keeping on top of it, I would say at the earliest, probably late spring, early summer, you might have some compost forming then. Oh, I'm not sure about the, since you're in Maryland, but Maryland does have a very, very good extension service. And each county in Maryland has it too. So if you want to contact them, I'm sure they would. Even a 4-H program might be interested in your practicing with your tree. So yeah, Maryland has a really nice extension service too. Your peony's not blooming much. So you want to make sure that it's not, if it's crowded and you haven't divided it in a very long time, that could be one reason it's not blooming well. So you might want to divide it. If it's not blooming well, but it's growing out a lot of leaves, make sure you're not fertilizing too much. And if you're not fertilizing at all, it might be a good idea to fertilize. So I'm not quite sure if any diseases came into play, but if you want to, you can send me an email separately, and we can look into that. Oh, the evergreens, you're going to have to find out where your prevailing winds are coming from. So that's not always going to be the same on every site. So whatever direction your wind comes in the wintertime, primarily, that's the direction you want to do it perpendicular to the wind direction. Plant your evergreens screen. The sun direction is mostly for deciduous trees. So you want to plant more, if you want cooler, lower cooling costs in the summertime, plant your deciduous trees on the south side of your house so that they block the sun from hitting your house in the summer, cools down your house, lower cooling bills. And the reason you want to use deciduous trees is because the leaves fall in the winter, and then the sun can come down and warm your house in the winter time. So that's what we were talking about with the sun direction. Wind direction, you have to play with a little bit more. You have to figure out which direction the wind normally comes in the winter. And then you can plant the evergreen screen then. Y'all are very welcome. Oh yeah, the Virginia she's talking about using a black pot. Yes, the sun is absorbed by the black pot, so that would definitely help out. Yeah, it's very sad rosemary doesn't always overwinter. But that should be able to help out though. Vegetables, it's hard to say. We've had a very wet fall so far, I would consider. So you probably haven't had to water very much at all. It's just depending on checking on the weather. If you do have them in a greenhouse, it's a better idea to have a checking schedule instead of a watering schedule. So check them at least every couple of days. If they don't need water, they don't need water. Yeah, having a watering schedule is actually, you can run into trouble. It's better to keep plants drier than too wet. So making a checking schedule, you can check for diseases then, you can check for insects then, and then you can check to see if it needs water. So that's a better plan than having a watering schedule. bare root deciduous shrubs, no, they should be fine in the winter. You can run into trouble watering too much, so I would not water those in the winter time. Bugs in general, it's very hard to say. Most of the leaf-eating types of beetles and other types of bugs, they should be gone once the freezing temperatures come. So you shouldn't run into those issues then. Other types of mites and stuff, they're not eating your leaves too much, but they can be in the wintertime, so you do have to watch out for that. Fertilizer for the wintertime, I would not fertilize too much in the winter. Unless you have the vegetables inside in a greenhouse, then you can do your regular fertilizing schedule. You are going to reduce your fertilizer levels though compared to the summer. So fruit trees planted early summer this year. Yeah, you can fertilize in the fall. That is fine to do. It's better to do it based off a soil test though. Soil testing kits, at least in Virginia, I think other states are the same way. You can get it at any cooperative extension office, and every county in Virginia has a cooperative extension office. The Culpeper one is at 101 Southwest Street in the town of Culpeper, across from the courthouse. And you can pick up the kit there. And then it has a mailing address on the form that you fill out, and you're going to mail it off to Virginia Tech. Yep, soil test first, correct. They will actually give you, if when you fill out the form, you can tell them what you want to grow. And they will give you a fertilizer recommendation then. So it's actually very, very handy to do the soil test. You get a fertilizer recommendation right then. Cherry apple seeds, cherry or apple seeds, I should say. Yes, you can plant those now. The only thing you have to worry about is a squirrel maybe coming by and eating them, but planting those now, especially for apples, they need a little bit of a winter chill. So planting those now is fine. And yeah, y'all are very much welcome. Thank y'all for attending today and all the great interaction and great questions. Yeah, thank y'all very much. And I don't think I see any more questions coming in. Oh, y'all are very welcome. Thank y'all for attending. And we are past time. I'm glad y'all were able to join us for the question session. I think we've lost some of the people that joined, but I did record the presentation today. Everyone that registered, I will send out the registration, a copy of the presentation today, because we didn't quite finish the entire presentation, so you can look at the rest then. And I will send out the recording of this presentation too, so y'all will receive all that. And I haven't quite decided on what kind of handouts to include yet, but I'll include a couple of good handouts too though. And like I said before, thank y'all very much for joining. If you have any questions, just let me know. My email address was on the on your registration email. So just go ahead and email me if you have any other further questions. And I hope y'all have a wonderful evening. Again, thanks for joining tonight.